In today's episode, we'll explore the fascinating history of the Comanche people, renowned as one of the most formidable tribes in the American Southwest. We'll delve into their cultural heritage, covering aspects of their traditions and legendary tales, including stories of mythical creatures like giants, dwarves, and water spirits. As a group closely related to the Paiutes, both descended from Shoshonean lineage, the Comanche share certain cultural threads with tribes like the Miwoks, whose stories we've discussed in past episodes. Our primary source for this journey is the North American Indian, Volume 19, Tribes of Oklahoma, the Wichita, Southern Cheyenne, Odo, and Comanche by Edward S. Curtis, published in 1930 under the patronage of J. Pierpont Morgan, with a foreword by Theodore Roosevelt. We'll begin by exploring the Comanche's spiritual customs, which were relatively few compared to other tribes. While not deeply religious, they did preserve a set of folk tales we'll read through, including the boy who escaped the giant, the dwarf's magical arrows, the woman and the dwarf, and the woman who married a giant. Afterward, we'll transition into a broader historical perspective on the Comanche, concluding with two more tales: the woman who betrayed her husband and the boy taken by the water lizard. The Comanche exemplify the unique traits that can evolve from a shared lineage. Though many Shoshonean tribes exhibit more peaceful tendencies, the Comanche were fierce plains rovers, distinct from the quiet Paiutes of California's deserts or the mild Hopi of Arizona. Ethnologists have noted a limited interest in ceremonial traditions among the Comanche, likely due to their focus on hunting and warfare. As the elders have expressed, they took pride in living as active warriors, with little regard for pondering existence's deeper questions. In 1847, David G. Burnett observed that the Comanche people had no clear origin story. According to their oral traditions, they believed their ancestors journeyed from the north, though they had no specific understanding of when or from exactly where. Burnett noted that their knowledge of the past was strictly oral, lacking any monuments or artifacts to commemorate significant events or heroic ancestors. He could find no songs, legends, or historical tales among them that celebrated notable deeds. In terms of spiritual beliefs, Burnett found that the Comanche's understanding of religion was as unrefined and limited as their knowledge of geography or astronomy. They held a vague concept of a great spirit, but he did not encounter any organized form of worship. Occasionally, he saw a shield, used in warfare, raised on the tip of a javelin with the handle grounded, consistently facing east at dawn. This practice seemed to be the only symbolic act hinting at religious expression. The Comanche had no formal priesthood or any equivalent, and if any spiritual authority existed, it appeared to reside loosely within the leadership of their chiefs. Burnett doubted that they held beliefs about an afterlife with rewards or punishments that shaped their moral conduct, nor did they possess a structured mythology or enduring religious narratives. Neighbor, a special agent assigned to the Comanche, conveyed insights about their beliefs to Schoolcraft, highlighting their limited knowledge regarding their origin. Their ancestral traditions were vague, with most Comanche believing they had always lived near their current lands, knowing only of one migration. This movement, many years ago, brought them from the west to encounter the mountain Spaniards in the mountains of New Mexico. Neighboring tribes acknowledged the Comanche skills in hunting and warfare, yet they remarked, "The Comanche do not know anything. They do not think," implying that the Comanche lacked deep spiritual knowledge rather than worldly expertise. The Comanche held a basic understanding of supernatural forces, recognizing good and evil spirits, though their spiritual beliefs were not highly elaborate. Unlike sedentary tribes, who often developed intricate religious customs, the Comanche, known for their nomadic lifestyle, had minimal ceremonies. One notable exception was the sun dance, in which they engaged in extreme acts of self-torture. Lacking a traditional Sundance lodge, they performed this ritual in a large teepee, crafted from extended poles draped with several layers of lodge coverings and incorporating songs borrowed from other tribes. As for their beliefs about the afterlife, Burnett noted that the Comanche believed those displaying exceptional skill and courage, demonstrated through acts like scalping or horse stealing, were destined for Elysian hunting grounds after death, a paradise where buffalo roamed in abundance and were always well fed. In contrast to the ideal afterlife promised to skilled warriors, those deemed wicked in Comanche culture faced a less fortunate posthumous fate. To enhance a deceased warrior's enjoyment in the afterlife, the Comanche would sacrifice several of his finest horses and bury with him his preferred hunting tools, thought to serve him in the next world. However, they held no clear conception of the specific location of these mythic hunting grounds. Mourning was an intense and ritualistic process. At designated intervals, relatives, particularly women, mourned with dramatic outcries, marking their sorrow with physical acts of grief. The female kin of the deceased would scarify their arms and legs using sharp flints, drawing blood from countless small cuts. The length of these lamentations, ranging from 3 to 7 days, depended on the deceased's reputation and status, after which the community symbolically let go, surrounding the grave with a figurative curtain of oblivion. In their spiritual practices, the Comanche invoked Father Above and Mother Earth, acknowledging a connection between Father Above and the sun, though this link remained vaguely defined. The golden eagle, a powerful symbol in Comanche culture, represents the sun and, in a broader sense, the infinite. Given the scarcity of cultural legends rooted in traditional values and teachings, gaining a clear understanding of the Comanche's inner beliefs and mental frameworks has become challenging. They believed that wisdom was a gift from the spirits, acquired individually through prolonged fasting. This knowledge could include healing skills and ceremonial practices, and it was transferable to others. One of their mythological tales, The Boy Who Escaped from the Giant, tells of a young boy who was playing far from camp when a giant captured him and carried him away in a tightly bound bag. Despite his efforts, the boy couldn't escape. Just as he was losing hope, a small bird perched on the bag, and upon hearing its chirps, the boy felt hopeful once more. He asked the bird for help, and it returned with a fire drill. The bird instructed, "Set the bag on fire and burn up the giant." Following this advice, the boy ignited the bag, and as soon as a hole appeared, he leaped out. While the giant struggled with the flames, the boy managed to escape. Another tale, The Magic Arrows, recounts the story of a man returning from a warpath across hilly terrain. Along the way, he heard a voice pleading for help, though he couldn't locate its source. The voice continued calling out, "I need help if anyone is nearby." In the story of the magic arrows, a man returning from the warpath hears a distress call, though he can't see anyone at first. Moving toward the sound, he finally discovers a tiny dwarf at his feet. The dwarf was being hunted by a hawk and had tried to defend himself with arrows, but missed every shot as the sun blinded his aim. The man sheltered the dwarf, and they spent the night together. In a dream, the dwarf told him, "You saved me, so I will grant you a power. I will give you my bow and arrows. Discard yours. If you ever see a hawk, don't try to kill it, for you never will. Keep my arrows instead. When you hunt, use the 2 arrows without flint tips. No matter how distant the animal, they will hit their mark. Just aim and shoot. But remember, never aim at a hawk." In The Woman and the Dwarf, a woman journeying through the hills at dusk hears a voice calling to her. Her husband, who had accompanied her, had been killed along the way. Although she sees no one as she looks around, she eventually notices a dwarf at her feet, standing in the doorway of his home with a quiver of arrows on his shoulder. He warns her, "Come into my house and stay here. A giant is on your trail, and if he finds you, he will devour you." She hides, and soon the giant appears, demanding, "Have you seen anyone come by here? I'm following a woman. I want something to eat." The dwarf replies, "No one's passed by tonight." Still suspicious, the giant insists, "Her tracks lead right to your door." The dwarf challenges him, "Lift the house and see for yourself." As the giant leans down to look inside, the dwarf swiftly cuts off his head, sending it rolling away. The dwarf called the woman out of his house and informed her, "The giant is dead. Start your journey home now, as your camp is very far away. You were close to being his meal, but I saved you." In the tale of the woman who married a giant, a young mother took her little son to the creek for a bath. As they were preparing to leave, a striking young man approached and invited her to go with him. She eventually agreed, and as the journey was long, they decided to marry along the way. By evening, they arrived at his home, which shimmered like silver in the moonlight. But when she awoke the next morning, she discovered that her husband had transformed into a giant, leaving her terrified. Desperate to escape and return to her people, she pondered many plans but found none feasible. After several days, she thought of an excuse to go to the creek and said to him, "I need to go down to the creek to wash clothes for my boy." The giant saw no harm in the woman's plan and allowed her to go to the creek. Once there, she spotted a large bullfrog by the bank and confided in him, saying, "Brother Bullfrog, the giant will call for us soon, and I am afraid of him. When he calls, please say we are still washing." The bullfrog replied, "Sister, I shall help you." He gave her a small bag containing a feather and a piece of buffalo cow's stomach, explaining, "The giant will chase you, and when he does, throw these items down to delay him." As the woman and her son fled, the bullfrog faithfully answered the giant's calls with, "We are still washing." Eventually, the giant grew suspicious of the delay and came to the creek to check on them, only to find they had vanished. Enraged, he began chasing them, closing the distance quickly. In a panic, the woman looked back, saw the giant approaching, and threw down the feather as Frog had instructed. As soon as the woman threw the feather, a thick fog rose up, enveloping the landscape. The giant, disoriented, wandered aimlessly in the mist for a long time before finally breaking free and picking up the trail once more. As he drew near again, the woman threw down the buffalo cow's stomach, which transformed into a rugged landscape of canyons and ravines. The giant struggled through this rough terrain, losing precious time, but eventually managed to resume the chase. When the woman and her son reached a river without a way to cross, they followed the bank until they spotted Crane. Desperate, they pleaded, "Brother Crane, the giant is after us. Help us escape." Crane advised, "Take a louse from your head and crack it in your teeth while you cross." Extending his long legs across the river, he created a bridge, and they crossed safely. When the giant arrived, seeing his prey had escaped, he demanded angrily, "Crane, take me across, or I'll kill you." Crane stretched his legs out for the giant, but midway across, he withdrew them, sending the giant plunging into the river. The woman's last sight of him was as he floundered helplessly in the water. The Comanche are unique among Oklahoma's tribes, being the only representatives of the Shoshonean stock in the state. Although many tribes in Oklahoma were forcibly relocated there, the Comanche were no strangers to the area. It had been part of their extensive hunting and raiding grounds for many years. Unlike other tribes, the Comanche roamed a vast territory. Oral traditions hint that before encountering the white settlers, their central homeland was around the headwaters of the Platte River in present-day Wyoming. In their early history, the Comanche and Shoshone tribes were likely one unified group, originally mountain dwellers. As their numbers grew, so did their boldness, and they eventually migrated onto the plains. Internal rivalries and factional conflicts led to a division between the groups, creating a lasting separation. The Comanche group moved southward, drawn in part by the availability of horses, which had been introduced to the area about 150 years earlier. By the 18th century, Comanche raids extended far into Mexico, marking nearly 2 centuries of dominance. Through natural expansion and raiding, they amassed large horse herds, granting them unprecedented mobility. The Comanche's extensive territory was rich with buffalo, providing ample food with minimal effort. Their range and raiding domain formed a vast oval stretching from the South Platte River in northern Colorado to deep within Mexico, bordered by the Rio Grande in the west and the Arkansas Hills to the east. In this expansive empire, the Comanche had no allies. Though their lives were marked by constant warfare, their focus on capturing horses and women helped sustain a robust population. Buffalo provided them not only with food, but also with materials for clothing, shelter, and nearly every other necessity, with each additional wife contributing to the household's wealth through skills such as tanning. A man's prosperity grew with his household size. In the early 18th century, Comanche raids frequently targeted Pecos and nearby Pueblo villages in New Mexico, with Pecos suffering the worst attacks. Once a thriving Pueblo settlement, Pecos endured relentless assaults from the Comanche, and by 1838, continuous losses forced its last survivors to abandon the village. In one of the final large raids on Pecos, the Comanche reportedly killed half of the male population, nearly all the elderly women, and took over 100 women as captives. The Comanche held particular enmity toward Mexicans and Mexican Indian groups, who suffered greatly from their raids. The Comanche viewed the Mexicans and New Mexican Indians collectively as Mexicans and, when recounting their exploits, emphasized their raids against the Carisas, a group that included Texans. This animosity created an environment of continuous conflict between Texan settlers and the Comanche, resulting in the eventual expulsion of the tribe from Texas. Interestingly, the Comanche generally held no inherent hostility towards Americans outside of Texas and often preferred to avoid conflict with them. However, after forming a peace agreement with the Kiowa around 1795, they were occasionally pulled into confrontations with American frontiersmen. The Kiowa harbored strong opposition toward Americans, comparable to the Comanche's enmity toward Texans and Mexicans. When the Kiowa first migrated south and encountered the Comanche, both tribes endured years of fierce, costly warfare. Recognizing the toll it was taking, their chiefs eventually agreed that a strategic alliance would serve them better than further bloodshed. Although minor conflicts occasionally interrupted the peace, their alliance endured, largely attributed to the influence of a trader known to them as Siparit. At the time, the Comanche chief was Pathiago, with Sikari leading the Kiowa. In Comanche culture, marriage customs were flexible. Individuals could freely choose their spouses, provided they were not close relatives. There was no formal ceremony, and polygyny was common. Infidelity was punished in the traditional manner of the Plains tribes, with the offending woman's nose partially cut off, a disfigurement that likely deterred such transgressions. Despite the severe punishment for infidelity, the Comanche's love of gambling occasionally led women to take risky chances, even with the potential consequence of nose cutting. During the summer of 1926, the author witnessed such an instance in an encampment where a woman suffered this fate. However, Comanche women, on average, were generally as chaste as their Caucasian counterparts. In his observations on Comanche family dynamics, neighbors noted that the bonds of kinship were deeply valued, extending not only to direct family members but also to relatives by marriage, who were often regarded and referred to as brothers. Any offense against one family member was seen as an offense against all, and retaliation was a shared responsibility within the family. Marriage among the Comanche was flexible, lasting only as long as both parties were content. Men could divorce their wives at will, and polygamy was widely practiced, with some chiefs having over 10 wives. Although infidelity was commonly punished by nose-cutting or, in rare cases, death, women often escaped punishment, while the seducer could be stripped of his property, which customarily went to the wronged husband. Women were responsible for all manual labor, while men devoted their time to hunting and warfare. Jealousy frequently led to conflicts, though the husband maintained complete authority over his wife. Their lodges were typically well kept, and visitors were expected to follow a specific route and seating arrangement designated by the lodge owner. Deviation from these customs could be offensive. While cautious around strangers, the Comanche were hospitable and social toward those they considered friends. The Comanche had no set meal times, eating instead whenever they felt hungry. Individuals would serve themselves and join a meal without any need for invitation or formalities. Parental authority was strong regarding marriage arrangements, as daughters were often purchased by their suitors at an agreed price, with no ceremonial process involved. Marriages began at a young age, and names given in early childhood often changed later to reflect significant life events or accomplishments. Today, the Comanche live on a designated reservation in Caddo County, Oklahoma, shared with the Kiowa and Kiowa Apache under the provisions of the Treaty of 1867. The lands allotted to the Comanche held great agricultural potential, and some of the more forward-thinking members successfully farmed their plots, despite the tribe's lack of an agricultural tradition before reservation life. However, most preferred to lease their lands to white settlers. Elderly men often gather, recounting the vibrant days of their ancestors when life was filled with action, while men of all ages spend much of their time discussing legal claims and suits against the government for broken treaties. Now, let's turn to a story from Comanche mythology titled The Woman Who Betrayed Her Husband. In a certain camp lived a woman, her husband, and her 4 brothers. One night, a hostile tribe raided the camp and took the woman captive. In The Woman Who Betrayed Her Husband, the woman's husband and 4 brothers set out to rescue her, tracking her to the hostile camp. Upon arrival, the husband positioned his brothers in a nearby cottonwood grove and hid himself by the waterhole, knowing his wife would eventually come for water. Finally, she arrived, and he signaled her to his hiding place. She appeared pleased to see him, and after a brief conversation, told him she would first bring water to her captor before returning with him. However, she went to her captor, whom she had married in captivity, and told him of a dream in which 4 enemies hid in the cottonwood grove and another by the waterhole. She described this man as her former husband and detailed his clothing, pleading that, if her dream were true, he would not harm the husband. Taking her dream seriously, the captor and his warriors surrounded the grove, killing the 4 brothers and capturing the husband. That night, they mocked and tormented him, with his wife encouraging them in their language. They then suspended him by his wrists between 2 poles, leaving him to die. When the camp broke the next morning, an old woman, lingering to search for any valuable items, found him. She said, "I have a son who looks just like you. For his sake, I shall set you free." She cut him down, gave him a horse, and helped him return home. In The Boy Who Was Stolen by a Water Lizard, a tribe had set up camp by a river, including a man, his wife, and their young son. The next day, before heading out to hunt, the father told his wife not to let their son out of her sight. But as she became engrossed in tanning a deer hide, she forgot to watch him. When she finished her work, she realized her son was missing and searched all around, but to no avail. That evening, her husband returned and asked about the boy, and she confessed she had lost track of him. Darkness had fallen, so they had to wait until morning to follow the boy's trail, which led them to a deep pool. They saw where he had taken a drink, but there were no tracks leading away from the water, leading them to believe a water creature had taken him. Heartbroken, they mourned as if he were gone. Determined to find his son's body, the father fashioned a long pole and probed the pool, discovering a hole beneath the bank. He then told his wife he would dive in to investigate what lay beneath the water surface. The father took his knife, determined to defend himself if any creature attacked, and before diving into the pool, he told his wife, "If I am not back by noon, return to camp, as I will not have survived." Diving into the water, he crawled along the submerged passageway until he glimpsed a distant light. Upon reaching it, he found his son sitting and crying. A large water lizard then spoke, explaining, "My son brought your boy here without permission. You may take him back." The water lizard also gave the father 4 pebbles, instructing him to throw the first pebble when he encountered water so it would part for him, and to use each pebble in the same manner to ensure safe passage. Following these instructions, the father and son emerged safely on the riverbank. With that, we conclude this episode on the history of the Comanche tribe based on Edward S. Curtis's 1930 documentation. While the Comanche lack a central creation story or religious text, they possess a wealth of traditional folk tales, including intriguing accounts of giants and dwarves, similar to other legends we've explored. It's possible these stories were imaginative creations rather than reflections of actual creatures. However, it's also conceivable that ancient encounters with other groups, perhaps much larger or smaller than the Comanche, left an impression on their oral traditions. Some of these tales might even date back to the time when the Comanche were still connected to their Shoshone ancestors in Wyoming. The dwarves in these stories could have been some of the little people of Wyoming, and the giants may have been related to the red-haired cannibalistic tribe that the Paiutes exterminated several hundred years ago. We also heard the peculiar story of the boy who was taken by a water lizard. I really don't know what to make of that story. Many of the stories in this book that I chose not to read included tales about the fox. These include fox's medicine, fox and pelican, fox and beaver, fox and owl, fox and the bears, the man and the fox, and fox and opossum. So in addition to the golden eagle having a special symbolic place in Comanche culture, it appears that foxes may be highly revered as well. So what do you think about these additional stories of giants and dwarves from another Native American tribe, the Comanche? Do they suggest the possibility of other prehistoric races of human or human-like creatures? Or is all of this confined to the realm of mythology? Let us know what you think in the comments. This channel is called because we cover actual history that has now been deemed unworthy to discuss on history channels on TV and unworthy of display time in our national museums. We try to cover the history found deep in the pages of old books, books that were written long ago and carefully laid down for posterity by people whose shoes we are unworthy to stand in. If you'd like to join our mission to keep actual history alive, then you can join our Patreon page or become a YouTube channel member. Your contribution towards carrying the torch of actual history will be recognized at the end of each episode, and you will also have access to our special members-only videos. So if you want more episodes like this, then be sure and subscribe.